The Canon R5 is a legend in the photography world, known for delivering fantastic photos and powerful videos. And now, it's $1,500 cheaper than its successor, the R5 Mark II. On paper, the R5 Mark II boasts impressive upgrades like 30 frames per second, pre-capture, and a stacked sensor. But here's the big question. Do these fancy sounding upgrades actually make a big difference in the real world? Or are you better off going with an original R5 and saving yourself $1,500 or even more along the way? Let's find out. My name is Jan Wegener and I've been using multiple R5 bodies ever since they've been released in 2020, capturing millions of photos and videos with them, including some of my most iconic shots. And since August of 2024, when the R5 Mark II was released, I've added 2 of those camera bodies to my kit, taken them all across Australia and challenged them in some of the most difficult to shoot conditions. Having used that many R5 bodies extensively in the field, I think puts me in a pretty good position to tell you what's great and not so great about each body and help you decide which one will be the right one for you. When you compare both of these camera bodies, they're actually quite similar in design, weight and overall feel. There's a few differences between the 2 bodies, but overall the handling basically stayed the same between the R5 and the R5 Mark II. What stands out on the back of the R5 Mark II is the much bigger looking electronic viewfinder, but most of this is due to the fact that it now has the eye-controlled autofocus, something that we can't find in a Canon R5. But when it comes to the actual resolution and the magnification of the EVFs, they've stayed the same in both cameras, so there's no real difference when it comes to the viewfinder experience overall. The same is true for the LCD flip-out screens on both cameras, which are essentially the same design and resolution. The only other thing that has changed on the back of the camera is the updated joystick design that we can find on the R5 Mark II, which I find lies slightly nicer in your hand, but in the end really doesn't make much of a difference. So when it comes to the design of the front and the rear of the camera bodies, both designs are still quite similar and you won't feel much of a difference. But where all the change happened is on top of the camera bodies. Here the original R5 had an on and off switch on the left hand side and no dedicated photo and video switch, but you could assign the MFN button on top of the camera to switch between photo and video. And this design has now completely changed on the R5 Mark II. There we have a dedicated photo and video switch on the left hand side, where the original R5 used to have the on and off switch. And on the right hand side of the camera body we now have an on, off and lock switch. The one thing we can't do anymore is to assign the photo and video switching to the MFN button on top of the camera, which I would have preferred. If you're using flash, you will definitely prefer the R5 Mark II though, because first of all, you have the new multifunction hot shoe on top of the R5 Mark II, and you're also able to use the flash with the electronic shutter on the R5 Mark II, which is something that you cannot do with the R5. There you have to use the mechanical shutter or the first curtain electronic shutter to be able to use flash. One of the biggest differences between the 2 cameras is the sensor. They both come with the same resolution of 45 megapixels, but the R5 comes with a non-stacked, relatively slow readout sensor, whereas in comparison the R5 Mark II comes with a stacked and very fast readout sensor. On top of the higher frame rate of up to 30 frames per second with the electronic shutter, the R5 Mark II also allows you to select what frame rate you want to shoot on with the electronic shutter, whereas on the R5 you're always stuck with 20 frames per second in the electronic shutter mode. Having a much faster readout stacked sensor in the R5 Mark II has allowed Canon to remove a lot of the image wobbles and rolling shutter that was quite prevalent in the original R5. Now there's one downside though with the stacked sensor, but we'll talk about that a little bit later in this video. Having that stacked sensor with an adjustable faster frame rate is definitely a bit of an advantage here for the R5 Mark II, and on top of that it can also shoot 14-bit RAWs across all the different shutter modes, whereas the R5 can only shoot 12-bit in the electronic shutter mode. When it comes to the mechanical shutter, both cameras here shoot in 14-bit RAWs and also at 12 frames per second, so no change there. Both of the R5 models are also compatible with their respective battery groups. And I like using their battery groups in the field because it's easier to hold the camera, shoot in vertical, and also gives me extended battery life. And here I see a bit of an edge with the R5 Mark II because the newly designed battery grip for that camera simply lies better in your hand and the joystick is also easier to reach. The battery grip of the original R5 kind of lies a bit awkwardly in your hand. When it comes to the batteries and battery life, there's definitely a bit of a difference between the two cameras because the R5 Mark II requires you to buy Canon's latest LPE6P batteries that have a little bit of a higher capacity, and only if you use those batteries you get certain features unlocked like pre-capture. The R5 on the other hand can use some of the older Canon batteries without many or any restrictions. So when it comes to battery life, both cameras are somewhat the same, and I would recommend to take at least 2 or 3 spare batteries with you in the field if you're intending to shoot for full day. Or if you're using the camera with a battery grip, I would have 4 batteries with me, 2 in the grip and 2 spare, and that should definitely get you through a full day of shooting. Something else that doesn't have changed on both cameras is the card slots. They still have one CF Express Type B card slot and one SD card slot. Lovers of noisy cameras, which is not me, but each to their own, will also be delighted that we now can have electronic shutter sounds with the R5 Mark II. On the R5, if you use the electronic shutter, it's just completely silent, whereas on the R5 Mark II, you can now select if you want to have an audible shutter sound. Since both cameras can shoot at 20 or even 30 frames per second, a big buffer is also an important feature. And here, the R5 II and the R5, kind of like all Canon cameras, fall a little bit short. Not so much because the buffer is small, which it kind of is, but also because of the buffer design that Canon implements in their cameras. Because we have a hard stop. Whenever we hit the buffer and we get 0 shots available, the camera will prevent you from shooting for a few seconds, which can sometimes feel like an eternity in the field and you may miss the action. If you're shooting fast, repetitive action with both cameras in full RAW and with their highest frame rates, you'll definitely be able to hit the buffer quite quickly. And this is why I would recommend for most cameras to shoot in compressed RAW, because these C-RAW files are much smaller in size but essentially give you the same image quality, but in return allow you to have a much larger buffer size available. So on the original R5, that's basically all we can do. Set it to the electronic shutter 20 frames per second and C-RAW, and then you get about 200 files in a burst, which is okay. On the R5 Mark II, if you shoot at 30 frames per second, even in C-RAW, you can still hit the buffer relatively quickly. And this is where the adjustable frame rate comes in quite nicely, because oftentimes I feel like I don't need the 30 frames per second and I don't want to run into the risk of hitting my buffer too quickly. So most of the time, actually, I reduce the frame rate on the R5 Mark II to 20 frames per second, and then the buffer is definitely sufficiently sized and lasts you much longer than on the original R5. But even the best specs are kind of useless if the cameras don't produce great looking images, right? I could show you amazing images I've taken with the original R5 for days, and it has never let me down in the field when it comes to image quality. Sure, there was a little bit of rolling shutter or a little image wobble here and there, but the file quality overall has been fantastic. With great detail, great sharpness, and quite good noise levels at high ISOs. The R5 is definitely one of the best camera bodies on the market when it comes to image quality and a fantastic all-rounder. And when we look at files from the R5 Mark II, we can see that it's no slouch either, and the tradition of great image quality has continued in that body. Overall, I'm extremely happy with the RAW files I get from both camera bodies, and if you see them side by side in the field, in almost all situations you wouldn't be able to tell them apart. Yet there's one area where the stack sensor of the R5 Mark II actually gives us a little bit of a disadvantage, and that is the available dynamic range at very high ISO levels. If you're shooting at ISO up to 3200 and run your RAW files through a good DeNoise program like DXO Pure RAW for instance, you will basically not be able to see any difference between the two RAW files and get fantastic results from both cameras. But if you're pushing it a little bit higher, from like 6400 onwards, you will see that the R5 pulls away a little bit and gives us more details with less noise in darker underexposed areas. Now we have to keep in mind that this only happens in extreme situations, and not all low light situations are the same. Because oftentimes we may find ourselves in a situation where we have a relatively low light, but our subject is still nice and evenly lit. And here on both cameras you could easily use ISO 12800, denoise the file and get fantastic results. Where we're quickly seeing the differences between the two cameras come up is when we're dealing with dark low light situations that also have a large dynamic range. For instance, a dark bird with a bright background or black and white bird. In these situations, we often have to underexpose a little bit not to blow out the highlights on our subject or the background, But then at the same time, that results in our subject being a little bit underexposed. And if in these situations you're also using high ISOs, the original R5 will make it easier for you to pull out details out of these dark areas and still giving you not too much noise and letting you return some of that detail. This is not so much a knock on the R5 Mark II because it's kind of performing right in line with the rest of the market, but rather a standout feature of the original R5 that allows us to shoot at very high ISOs and still maintain a great dynamic range. On the R5 Mark II, I have to use every little bit of my editing knowledge to be able to end up with a nice final image that doesn't have too much noise and still some details in it. And if you want to learn exactly that, how to edit even your most difficult to edit images, I'd highly recommend that you check out my Lightroom and my next generation Photoshop Masterclasses. In there, I'll guide you through every step of the editing process and also provide you with the raw files that I'm working on so you can edit right alongside me. I know these classes will enable you to finally get the results that you're after and turn editing from a frustrating chore into a rewarding experience. But don't just take my word for it. Check out the amazing reviews I've received from everyone who has already taken the classes and were able to transform their editing skills and achieve great results, and even some competition winners. So if you want to do the same and get fantastic results from your own raw files, I'd highly recommend that you check out my Lightroom and Photoshop Masterclasses down there in the description. Overall, the image quality of both camera models is fantastic. The R5 gives us great image quality all across the board and shines at these higher ISO levels, whereas the R5 Mark II definitely gives us an edge when it comes to action and fast moving subjects with less image wobbles and basically no rolling shutter. So in the end, I'm still happy with the image quality that I'm getting out of the R5 Mark II even at these higher ISO levels, but I wish Canon had managed to maintain the same image quality that we were used from the original R5. Let's look at one of the most important aspects of a camera, the autofocus and the subject detection. Personally, I always liked the autofocus on the R5. It was nice and fast, stuck to the subject nicely, and also identified most subjects quite easily. When it came to action, there was definitely a bit of room for improvement, but overall the performance was very good. And the R5 Mark II brought us this improvement. The autofocus overall is noticeably faster, snappier, and jumps on your subject much easier, especially when it comes to birds in flight and action photography. The subject detection on the R5 Mark II, I'd say overall has improved as well, and it's able to now track even smaller birds in busier scenes. The only downside I sometimes experience on the R5 Mark II is that the autofocus can be a bit hyperactive at times. And this shows especially if you, for instance, focus on a bird that's about to take off, but you don't know when it takes off and you just keep focusing on it. And after a little while, the R5 Mark II has the tendency to start wandering off your subject and onto something else. This doesn't happen all the time, but it's definitely a tendency I've noticed with that camera. The best way to deal with that is to go into the menu and make some changes to the autofocusing settings like I show you in my setup videos. And there's one area we haven't even talked about yet. I mentioned before that the R5 Mark II struggles a little bit with the dynamic range at very high ISO levels, but it actually makes up for that when it comes to the autofocus, because low light autofocus performance has dramatically improved with the R5 Mark II. The original R5 often struggled when it got quite dark, for instance when I was photographing the birds of paradise, whereas the R5 Mark II is able to jump right onto your subject even in very dark situations. So the low light autofocusing performance is dramatically improved with the R5 Mark II, and one of the main reasons that I enjoy using the autofocus so much, because it just is a lot more accurate in very difficult and extreme situations. One thing I always recommend when it comes to mirrorless cameras, and you can also see in my setup videos, is to set them up with double back button autofocus. One button for the eye tracking autofocus and one button for the traditional spot autofocus. Because when we only use the eye tracking autofocus, it can get confused sometimes, especially if there's a lot of other things surrounding your subject. And in these situations, it's good to be able to use the spot autofocus on another button to direct the autofocusing field exactly onto your subject and help the camera to stay onto your subject. If you're the owner of one of Canon's f11 lenses, the 600 or 800mm, you'll also find the R5 Mark II advantageous because it will allow you to have a much larger focusing area available. On the original R5, it's just a small square, whereas on the R5 Mark II, this area is much bigger. There's one more feature when it comes to the autofocus that the R5 Mark II has that the R5 doesn't have. and that is the eye-controlled autofocus, where the camera scans your eyeball basically, and wherever you look, you can move your focusing point to, for instance. Now, in certain situations, this works quite well. In other situations, it doesn't work at all. So it's up to you how highly you value this feature. But in certain situations, this can work quite well if you have a lot of people or a lot of birds in your viewfinder. And then you can use your eye to directly control the autofocus and put it onto exactly the bird or person that you want to focus on. There's another feature that the R5 Mark II has that the R5 doesn't have. But this time around, it's one I wouldn't want to live without anymore, and that is pre-capture. On the R5 Mark II, you can activate pre-capture, and then the camera will pre-record 15 RAW files for you in a loop whenever you half press the shutter button. And when you fully press the shutter button, the last half second of images will be recorded right onto your memory card. So it's very hard to miss a crucial moment anymore, because even if you're that split second too late, the camera will have already captured the scene for you. And don't think of pre-capture as just being useful for like a takeoff scene. I often like using pre-capture, for instance, if I'm dealing with a subject that moves around very quickly. For instance, a tiny bird that's always looking away from me and then just very briefly looking at me and then looks away from me again. Without pre-capture, it's quite easy to miss that one split second where the bird looks at me. Whereas with pre-capture activated, I can essentially half press my shutter button, wait until the bird looks at me, then fully press the shutter button, and I know that the camera will have recorded that scene, even if it only lasted for a very brief moment. So while I wouldn't label pre-capture a must-have, it's very close to that, and definitely one of the main things that stand out from the R5 Mark II compared to the original R5. Both cameras also come with IBIS, in-body image stabilization, and in combination with the image stabilization in the Canon lenses, it gives us a fantastic performance, a nice and stable viewfinder, and allows us to do nice low shutter speeds handheld and even handheld video. And while the IBIS performs very well in both of these camera models, there's definitely quite an edge with the R5 Mark II, and I find the performance overall to be quite improved over the original R5. I can even do emergency handheld video with a big 600mm prime lens, which is pretty crazy and something that I do use from time to time in the field. So having the improved IBIS is another advantage for me when it comes to the R5 Mark II. Speaking of video, both of these cameras are also fantastic video cameras, giving us oversampled 4K up to 30 frames per second, normal 4K up to 120 frames per second, and 8K as well. And when we look at the files from these cameras, they're also fantastic, nice and crisp with beautiful colors. However, there's a few aspects where the R5 Mark II is quite dramatically improved over the original R5. And the first one is overheating, not only in photo mode, but also in stills mode. And this is something that has plagued the original R5 from the beginning. In certain situations, this camera will just overheat. Over time, Canon made some changes, some firmware changes, and introduced a high heat threshold as well that has helped us deal with the overheating issues in the original R5. But in certain situations, if you're in a hot and humid climate, there's a good chance the R5 will overheat if you use it for extended periods of time in standby or do a lot of video. And this is something that can be quite annoying in the field. So I'm happy to see this much improved in the R5 Mark II. I've managed to get the camera to 7 out of 10 overheating bars, but I've never actually been able to get it to shut down on me, which is great. Now on all these cameras, I would definitely recommend to set the heat threshold to high, because then you'd get the heat warnings much later and the camera will stay on much longer as well. If you don't have the heat threshold set too high, you will very likely see heat warning quite quickly, not only if you're doing video, but also when you're using pre-capture on the R5 Mark II, which can also greatly contribute to quick overheating. In most normal climate situations, this is not a problem at all, but in very hot climates, the R5 Mark II will definitely have an advantage. But back to video, because it's not only the overheating that has improved, we also have much improved video autofocus. And what I find the most impressive here is how much smaller the subject can be in the frame now on the R5 Mark II compared to the original R5. If we look at this example where I was filming myself in the field, I'm not larger than a couple millimeters in the viewfinder, but the R5 Mark II has still been able to stay on me, whereas the original R5 or an R3 would have had a much harder time to track me from this distance. But the video autofocus has not only improved for people, I also find it more reliable and better overall for birds. Another feature that I find quite useful in the R5 Mark II is the addition of C-Log 2, which is the log mode that gives us the most dynamic range, the most flexibility when it comes to editing our video files. It's not always the easiest to color grade, but overall having the ability to get really high dynamic range was fantastic when I was filming the Birds of Paradise, for instance. If I was doing a lot of filming and I had to choose between the R5 Mark II and the R5, I would definitely gravitate towards the R5 Mark II because it has the better autofocus, less overheating, and the better overall performance with a lot of extra features like C-Log 2. For my style of shooting with a lot of action, perch birds, and also video, the advantages of the R5 Mark II definitely outweigh the disadvantages, and it would be my camera of choice. However, that doesn't necessarily mean that that would also be the right choice for you. Ultimately, you can't really go wrong with either of these cameras, and even though the R5 has a few years on its back now, it's still a high-performing camera that will deliver you fantastic results. So which one is the right one for you really depends on your use case. If you're shooting a lot of fast-moving subjects and action as well as video, the R5 Mark II definitely offers a nice upgrade because you have a stacked sensor, you have less rolling shutter, you have up to 30 frames per second, and you have pre-capture with less overheating. So in these scenarios, it's very compelling. So if some of these features feel like must-haves to you, then that basically answers your question and you may be better off going with an R5 Mark II. But if you feel like you're not only shooting action, you're looking more for an all-rounder, you might shoot a lot of landscapes or stills or people as well, then the R5 could be an excellent choice and could save you a lot of money. At least $1,500 if you look at new prices, but probably even $2,000 or more if you look at used cameras. So which one is it going to be for you? Have you already made your decision? Do you have an R5 Mark II, an R5, two R5s, two R5 Mark IIs? Are you looking at the cameras? Let me know in the comments. Give me a thumbs up for the video. Check out my channel membership, my masterclasses, and hit that subscribe button. And I'll see you guys in another video. Bye!